So welcome everyone on this sunny morning here, wintry morning in Waterloo. I'm delighted that we're joined here by Vanessa Ong. She is a second generation immigrant with Chinese and Vietnamese roots, and she holds a degree in urban planning here from Waterloo in the last year. And her research explores shifting place meanings and food security impacts for long-time low-income residents within a gentrifying urban core. She's also a creator of Littlefoot community projects and also co-farms a small plot of land on Block 2 of the Haldeman Tract, which opens up realms of possibility within our current food system through socially and ecologically conscious practices. And in her work, she emphasizes cultural preservation, memory, placemaking, and spiritual deep ecologies. And so we'll just also kind of situate, Vanessa's contribution within this course. We've been talking about cultural diversity and food justice along the way, and I'm, in different parts of the course in different ways. But I'm really delighted to have, this week more centering those pieces. And I think she's really well positioned to be guiding us through some of this discussion. So thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steffanie, for welcoming me into this Sustainable Food Systems series. So yeah, as Steffanie mentioned, my name is Vanessa, and I use she, her pronouns. So I'm here to speak to my experiences with food security and food justice issues in Kitchener-Waterloo. And I'll focus on how my partner and I created Littlefoot Community Projects, which is a not-for-profit focused on addressing the root causes of food insecurity. And I'll also share a little bit about my urban planning research, which was on food gentrification in the context of downtown Kitchener. But to start, I thought I'd take a moment to share a land acknowledgement because food systems work is so geographical and intrinsically tied to the land. So for my partner and I, we are so humbled to be growing on Stone Meadow Farm, which is in Maryhill, Ontario. And it's alongside the hobby farmers there, Janet and Roger. But we also recognize that we are on stolen lands. So we're on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Ottawandarok, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. So our life and work exists on Block 2 of the Haldeman Tract, which is 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, granted to the Six Nations of the Grand River for allying with the British during the American Revolution. And I think we need to remember that this is a vast piece of land. It's over 380,000 hectares. And so this land-based work requires us to be deeply reflexive in all that we do, including unpacking our privileges, inviting criticisms, to listen, and to promote the healing of this earth that we call home. And yeah, we take this pretty seriously in our decision-making and planning efforts. Yeah, so I thought I'd start with some of my experiences and kind of my academia-focused experiences. So during my undergrad, I developed a strong interest for food insecurity, food security issues, and decided to explore that in both academia and work. And So currently I'm working as a small scale farmer, still kind of new to agriculture, but really drawn to it. So I actually started by interning really intensively with Angie at Fertile Ground Farm for 3 months in 2017. And I know that you just had a nice chat with her. And then I also interned and now work with the Working Center Market Garden. So I just finished up my 3rd season with them. And in 2020, I finished my Master of Environmental Studies in Planning at UW, where I looked at sense of place and place disruption, as well as food security impacts for long-time low-income residents in downtown Kitchener. And my thesis included 2 manuscripts, one looking at the potential impacts of food gentrification on health, and the other focused on how residents might build a sense of place in the city, and emphasizing sociospatial equity in the city. And there's a lot there, but I thought I'd focus on my paper published with Social Science and Medicine. And this is an adaptation of one of my manuscripts titled Life Stories of Food Agency, Health and Resilience in a Rapidly Gentrifying Urban Center, building a multidimensional concept of food access. So the purpose of this study was to explore relationships between food security, health, and gentrification through a case study in Kitchener. And this is a city that's experiencing rapid urban change, especially in recent years. And one key objective for me was to really emphasize the life stories of individuals who have been navigating this changing food and urban environment, to kind of demonstrate patterns in their experiences, but also the power of their food agency within challenging systemic circumstances like poverty and gentrification, and also to really give space for their views and suggestions to be showcased in this body of work. But I thought that I would go through some key terms that help to provide some context, because I throw them around quite a bit, and maybe it would be helpful, might start discussion as well. So I thought I'd start with like defining food security, or attempting to. So I think it's important to see it as a context and culturally specific concept. You often hear about these different realms of availability, access, and use, which are important in shaping food security. And one kind of holistic definition was put forth by Food Secure Canada in 2004, which is the assurance that all people at all times have both the physical and economic access to the food they need for an active, healthy life. It means that the food itself is safe, nutritionally adequate, culturally appropriate, and that this food be obtained in a way that upholds basic human dignity. So often you see some like different iterations of that, but I think a lot of those pieces are important to keep there. And then in terms of like measurements, there are both direct and indirect measures, and some combination of them probably describes the full context of food insecurity. In Canada, the most widely used direct measure is called the Household Food Security Survey module, and it is circulated through the Canadian Community Health Survey. The health survey is, I believe, circulated annually, but the food security survey is not mandatory. So this has led to pretty inconsistent data across the country. And I'd say that we probably don't have a strong understanding of food insecurity stats in Ontario and nationally. Yes, but this is a survey that has 18 questions focused on how financial resources specifically restrain food access and use. And to my knowledge, I think the most recent survey was 2013-2014, which showed that 11.9% of households are classified food insecure in Canada. But note that this is really outdated and there are several limitations to the survey module itself in capturing the full picture of food insecurity. But you might pair this with like indirect measures like community level indicators, such as the Emergency Food Assistance Network in Waterloo, for example, keeps data on the number of food hampers that they distribute. There's also something called the Nutritional Food Basket that estimates costs of healthy eating. And then you can estimate food insecure populations based on like income to nutrition, basically. Yeah, and then I thought I'd stretch that concept a little further and discuss food justice. So I don't know how much you've talked about food justice in your class so far, but it's an important kind of way to analyze and work toward food security possibly, but could also be shaped as like a goal in itself. So food justice is widely used in food movement scholarship and activism. For many, it is understood as feminist, anti-racist, and anti-colonial. And there are some food movement scholars, Cadieux and Slocum, who describe it in terms of structural relations of power to confront race, class, and gender privilege in food systems, and also historical and collective traumas related to exchange, land, and labor. So that can include innovative land uses, promoting equity, fair compensation, and protections for farm workers. So it's really meant to be a sort of systemic kind of approach to food systems work. And then you might also hear about food sovereignty, which is also a popular term amongst activists, very focused on reclaiming rights and participation and challenging corporate food regimes. I believe it had origins in like peasant farmers movements, such as La Via Campesina. So it's often associated with more rural-based or very land-based issues, but I believe increasingly looks at food systems change in urban settings too. And if you're interested in that sort of realm, Leah Penniman of Soulfire Farm does beautiful work related to food justice and food sovereignty, especially around like racial justice and like land redistribution as well. Yeah, and then I've been throwing around this term gentrification, which might not be familiar for everyone. It's very common in planning circles these days, especially in the context of Waterloo Region, which is changing so quickly. Um, so gentrification is a complex, deliberate phenomenon intended to change the urban environment, typically resulting in the inmoving of wealthier populations who displace vulnerable residents. And I think it's really important. I included this in my study, but I think it's important to look at the place altering effects of not only like the large redevelopment practices, policies, but also some of the more mundane kind of changes that that create sort of symbolic changes in the city as well. And a couple of authors, Alcon and Kaji, also highlight that it's a racialized process. It predicates on previous divestment from the urban core, the devastation of segregated neighborhoods, and displacement of people of color by more affluent white residents. What you also see is like the loss or displacement of neighborhood organizations and services, or even retailers that once served marginalized communities. And I also really like, this is a little bit more abstract, but I really like a definition from Leslie Kern, which kind of looks at neighborhood rhythms and how different policies and practices and tools are used deliberately to render some lives arrhythmic to urban space. Yeah, I like that there's sort of an audio visual kind of element to that almost. Yeah, and my study looked at the concept of food gentrification, which is kind of a newer concept and not even very present in scholarship very much at all. But I was really interested in intersections between food and gentrification, and kind of drew from the work of Mickey Kendall, who's a Chicago-based scholar and activist. And she describes food gentrification as a process of elevating previously affordable foods or even staple ingredients to a condition of higher symbolic or aesthetic value and cost, and especially for racialized communities. So this is a much newer concept, not always explicitly referenced, but I did a bit of a literature review to try and find studies that made some of those connections that almost alluded to the concept. So a lot of the literature draws from like green gentrification philosophies or eco gentrification you might have heard of, and like greenwashing is a common term you might have heard of. And then also like food environment and race studies. But there's one author who describes that low-income communities can experience the deleterious effects of food driving gentrification. For example, you might have the popularization of alternative food initiatives, which could include like fancy organic food stores, or even like community gardens have been well studied in this realm. In terms of how they might increase property prices and attract new residents to a neighborhood, typically white, affluent populations. And then on the other hand, which is more in line with how Kendall shaped the concept, You can see cultural foods themselves being gentrified, which is basically to say that once affordable foods have become upscaled and made out of reach for racial and ethnic minorities. And this kind of looks toward critiques of like the foodie scene and also the way that food retailers shape different foods, cultural foods. Yeah, so my study was really exploratory in nature because this is kind of a newer concept. So I was just focused on looking at whether food gentrification might be experienced in any of these sort of articulations here in Kitchener. So I interviewed 20 participants for my study, and also 5 key informants who were food or service providers in the region. And they were kind of a secondary population just to add some like higher level perspectives and comments on the study. But the primary population were self-identified low-income adults who are longtime residents of Kitchener or Waterloo. And I put a 5-year threshold on that they've been here 5 years or longer. And that was meant to encompass a number of like big planning policies that had happened. There was like an engagement plan. Kitchener became a member of a sustainability initiative. They started a neighborhood strategy. And it was also the start of the LRT construction, which has been heavily criticized throughout its entire process, I think. Overall, my study was able to include residents who experienced displacement firsthand, including from renovictions, and also included residents who have been able to stay in place during their time in the city. But I basically put forth that food gentrification is a relevant concept and phenomenon for downtown Kitchener, especially due to redevelopment, housing pressures, and a loss of food charities observed by residents. They noted the relocation of food services to outside of the inner core and made a number of connections to how higher income in-movers affect their access to essential goods, and just generally expressed worry about whether their livelihoods are taken into account in broader planning mandates. And then we also saw discussions of food being gentrified, as it was kind of brought up by Mickey Kendall. People seeing the symbolic elevation of foods that were previously affordable, maybe when they were growing up in the city. And what we saw in response was participants managing their food needs in really creative and resourceful ways and employing their place-based knowledge in order to achieve that. But it is not to underplay the structural barriers that are in place, especially around social assistance, which is just really atrocious. And I basically wanted to emphasize that geographic planning solutions will not be enough on their own to address food security needs of residents. So for example, Kitchener, I believe recently included a policy around citing a grocery store or a food retailer within neighborhoods, like being able to cite a food retailer within neighborhoods of a certain distance so that there's that food access, which doesn't really acknowledge the the economic access pieces and the culturally appropriate pieces of food security. So just to really emphasize that. And then something that you see coming from kind of higher level key informants is suggestions of employing like cooking classes or like educating people more, which just almost devalues the deep knowledge that people already carry around food resources, and sort of underplays the need for really systemic changes to be employed. And I also really pushed for improved data on food security in general. Specifically, thought there was room to engage with residents who have faced forced relocations, because the health impacts of place disruption can be really serious. And also to engage with racialized food insecure folks, because my study and many others show that they face unique circumstances when experiencing food scarcity. Yeah, so at this point, I thought I'd transition into Littlefoot community projects and kind of going into that realm of my work. So yeah, in the midst of my master's program, my partner Dan and I also had the opportunity to start a land-based initiative, which we chose to centralize around food security in Kitchener-Waterloo. So we both come from an environmental background with a lot of interest in community food and growing food. And over the years, we would kind of research opportunities and just like casually daydream about a land-based project. We had a couple of chats with people through Farm Link, which I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but it's kind of an under-maintained online resource, which intends to connect farm seekers with opportunities. And that could range from just like a job as a farm worker, or also bigger like business partnerships, or like lease to own opportunities. So that was just kind of what we were looking into, but we happened to connect with Dan's friend of a friend, who has a hobby farm in Maryhill, which is just outside of Waterloo, not too far from here. And things moved pretty quickly once we met up, because we were compatible, and they said, you know, do you want 50 acres? Like, take it. And we were both like, I think I was still in school and working, and Dan was working full time. And it was like late spring at the time. So we said, we'll start with like a vegetable garden. But yeah, the owners have been really, really generous with us. They don't actually charge us rent or utilities, which is a huge factor for our not-for-profit work. And in fact, like we wouldn't be able to do this without that factor. But yeah, we first started by expanding an area that the farmer once used as a vegetable garden. And they supported so much by prepping the area with a tractor and helping to put up fencing around the perimeter, which is necessary due to their animals. And yeah, this area served us really well for a couple of years. We farm ecologically, so I know that you've heard a little bit about this throughout your talks. Yeah, I'm really lucky, privileged to have knowledge from from my farming experiences. So we integrate like drip irrigation, which is efficient. We utilize small plot intensive farming or spin farming, which allows us to grow on a pretty a relatively small, in terms of like farming, it's a pretty small area, but we grow some pretty good yields. And we're also very attentive to ecological principles like companion planting, and biodiversity, pollinator strips and stuff like that. And financially, we've been supported by grants like Carrot Cash and also the Waterloo Region's Community Environmental Fund. So with Carrot Cash, we built a shed / greenhouse structure from scratch with those funds. And we also integrated solar energy, which powers our irrigation system, which is kind of fun. And then the other grant funded our purchase of a trailer, which has allowed us to run our markets more smoothly, rather than stuffing our car with everything for market. And then also funded our expansion. So we now have an expanded area with fencing and trenched in water lines. And we're close to like a 1/4 acre in size. So we're talking like pretty small scale, but still farming really intensively to get decent yields. So in terms of our mandate, very broadly, we are trying to address the root causes of food insecurity in Kitchener-Waterloo in a way that is socially and ecologically conscious. I think what's challenging is getting caught up in the day-to-day of our work and trying to stay focused also on those systemic issues and longer term solutions. I think that comes through maybe more in our social media, like we try to really educate and share information on the root causes of food insecurity, and just to be like politically active in various realms as well. So my views here kind of come from engaged Buddhism thought, which is largely around like mindfulness practices to overcome suffering, and also is really in touch with social action in our daily living. And it doesn't always show up like explicitly. I think it's just kind of a way that like I enter into my work. But I think a really important insight is that of interbeing, which was coined by Zen teacher, master, and activist Thich Nhat Hanh. So he describes that, you know, we are the continuation of all our ancestors. Thanks to impermanence, we have a chance to transform our inheritance in a beautiful direction. So yeah, this doctrine is like really focused on how we and other beings and phenomena do not have independent existence. We come into existence because of other processes and factors. And yeah, I just think that this has a lot of potential to inform practices related to growing on the land and transforming relationships to the earth, especially as we think about our climate futures, and also can relate to social action in terms of emphasizing like our interdependence on this planet. So yeah, that's just kind of a foundational concept, I guess. And on that note, we also talk a lot about intersectionality in our mandate, which I think is really important to talk about, because it's meant to describe the really deep systemic questions around inequality. And here we apply it to our food systems work. It's really important to highlight that this was coined by a Black lawyer and activist, Kimberly Crenshaw, in 1989. And she specifically describes it in terms of bias and discrimination against Black women in multiple equity cases that were brought to court. And it's meant to describe a prism for seeing how various forms of marginality operate together and possibly exacerbate one another. And just to really look at the complex interplay of systemic barriers, as well as points of privilege. There's a really wonderful anti-racism activist, Salam Debs, who recently had a great talk on intersectional feminism. If anyone wants to see that, it's on her Instagram. So yeah, we like in terms of the context of food work, we know from tangible research as well as stories from lived experiences that in Canada, Indigenous populations, racialized people, and low-income groups are disproportionately affected by food insecurity. And so we know the importance of understanding how these inequalities intersect and overlap. And we want to take very seriously the impacts of difference in our food systems, and to contemplate how intersectionality might inform activism and policy, and our planning in our work with Littlefoot. Yeah, these are kind of like our touchstone concepts, I guess I'd describe them as. But it's meant that we engage with a pretty wide range of initiatives and partnerships. So in our first year, we shared a lot of our produce to KW Habilitation in their inclusive housing programming. And this changed when COVID hit, because they closed off to, KW Hab has a little bit of their own farm initiative, but with COVID, they decided to close off to outside sources. They might be opening back up, so it'd be nice to reconnect with them. Yeah, in our first year, we also sold food really affordably to new immigrants through Guelph's North End Harvest Market. And in the following year, we branched out a bit, offering sliding scale produce to Full Circle Foods. They've been really great in supporting our different ideas and seeing if they work in their store. Sometimes they don't. And we also we supplied a small food program at Emmanuel United Church, and continue to do that to this day. And in 2019, a big change for us was piloting, and this was kind of during my master's research, so it was informed by suggestions from there actually. But we piloted a pay what you choose produce market at Fresh Ground in Kitchener, a small cafe. But yeah, we call this the Feed Change Market. And it kind of makes up the bulk of our work these days. It's meant to be a compassionate, relationship-based and flexible way to access food. Yeah, and it was strategically designed around input of residents in my research. We have like even down to the details. I have a little pay box that allows people to pay really discreetly. We often have a lot of conversations around pricing just because people have a lot of questions around what is a bunch of kale worth? But we only offer suggestions based on our research of what is considered affordable. And ultimately they can pay very anonymously through this pay box system if they choose. Yeah, so it's really about building a sense of empowerment around food procurement, and kind of for us signifies the creation of space to reimagine the boundaries of community food work, focusing on groups who are marginalized within our food system. But we've also been trying to get in touch with more of the unhoused population and low income populations as well. This was kind of sparked by when I transitioned to supportive housing for one winter with the working centers, at the time new supportive housing initiative in Waterloo. But we started something called the Common Goods Project, which is meant to highlight housing and poverty as root problems to food insecurity, emphasizes kind of the share economy to meet essential needs, and also rethinking waste. So we often collect and redistribute essential goods and clothing, affordable household goods, and also rescue and share food from community fridges or even local farmers who have surplus, and just help to redistribute to communities in need. Yeah, so fundamentally it's kind of looking at issues within capitalist distribution systems and looking to create more sort of just modes of exchange, I guess. So yeah, overall, we are distributing, it varies from year to year. We're still pretty new, but we distribute close to 500 kilograms or just over 1,000 pounds of produce over the span of the season. And that was before our expansion, so I hope that will only grow more. And we also have been, connecting, as I mentioned, connecting with some local farmers, such as Smith Valley Organics, and sometimes they have product that is not suitable for their main market, but they offer surplus to us that we can help to distribute. So I hope that those connections just only grow. Yeah, that's all that I have.
I have a question, but this relates more to food gentrification. And just to preface, for this week's reading materials, we read your paper on gentrification and food insecurity, and it gave me such a great perspective on the issue of redesigning urban spaces for wealthier movers, and how this causes new powerful people and systems to imprint new rhythms onto existing communities. I really like that quote. Sorry, excuse me. And we also had the chance to read a paper that explores the ability of religions, such as Sikhism, to preserve existing food cultures and communities. And it discusses how religion with strong food communal practices can allow neighborhoods to remain authentic and even facilitate the participation of people outside of the food religion to join existing communities without disruption, and almost even to the point that it imprints existing rhythms onto new people and systems. And so given your background in planning, I guess what is your perspective on religious institutions in combating food gentrification? And are they acknowledged and supported by local governments or planning committees as sources of food for food insecure individuals? Given the decrease in these types of food programs and loss of religious institutions such as churches.
Yeah, that's a great insight. And this was something that did pop up in my interviews as well, actually, because I don't know about different contexts, but in Waterloo, well, in downtown Kitchener, we had heavy presence of churches in terms of various charitable services, but including food as well. And part of that was also the Out of the Cold movement, which maybe some of you have heard of it, but they used to be kind of this broad network of churches that supported bringing unhoused populations into the churches and feeding them, keeping them warm during the winter months. But that proved very logistically challenging, and I don't believe it was well supported. It was heavily reliant on volunteers, which is really beautiful in terms of community supports and mutual aid, but I think lacked the structure and resources from upper tiers like the government. So it kind of deteriorated, and I think that multiple residents in my study reflected on how that felt like a really big loss of a resource. So it was clear that the churches and religious institutions did play a big role in services here. I think that it's a complicated relationship because it might feel a little exclusionary in some ways when churches become a major source for emergency food, and it continues to maybe employ this idea of charitability and philanthropy that is quite short-sighted in the bigger realm of food security and food justice. But in the short term, I've definitely seen and heard from stories how important churches have been in the region. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers.
Yeah, I know that was great. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks.
Well, maybe I'll just close because I know we've been running really late, but I so appreciate everything that you've shared. It's really touching. And for me, it kind of resonates with this notion that, we're addressing multiple divides in society right now. There's an ecological divide, there's social divides. But I think the piece that we often don't name is what some people would say a spiritual divide, or sort of self from self. And I really appreciate all the efforts that you're putting in, to address that and sort of center your energies in a different way. And that's really beautiful.